right? This idea of Galileo as a martyr, Galileo who, was right and he was opposed to an authority that was wrong, and at the end he said, and yet it moves, which wasn't true either. The theories.
So he used this to support his heliocentric.
Exactly. So he was
model.
convinced by this that heliocentrism was true, and this is a fascinating thing. He had, his tide theory was wrong, but it was probably the thing that drove him to believe it, and that he'd
was
actually
a recent
been
discovery,
good point.
like 6 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So we're discovering a lot of things now.
Wow.
If the ideas from the alternative ideas from the past are presented back again, they can suddenly seem really persuasive because you have never seen them before.
So I made that post on X on Galileo shattering geocentrism with his observations of the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, and I said this supported the sun being the center of the universe. And you had quickly retorted that no, Galileo did not shatter geocentrism. And in fact, his observations were very well supported with some of the going geocentric models of his time period. I initially thought that you were just some internet troll that was trying to start a fight on X.
I mean, it's not entirely untrue. I do like to start a fight on X, and I'm flagging these kinds of keywords to try and to try and start these conversations. So I'm a bit of a nut, but and I'm often called a conspiracy theorist or all sorts of other things, but because people aren't prepared often for what the real history is.
Well, I mean, there are lots of conspiracy theorists all over the social media and the web. So it is difficult to sort of weed out the ones that knows things and the ones that don't. I guess one of the compelling reasons why I knew that you knew what you were talking about is that you were currently in the process of translating one of the most comprehensive astronomy textbooks of the 17th century, the Almagestum Novum by Giovanni Riccioli.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Where are you in that process?
So I'm on volume. I've finished volume 1, or I've called it volume 0 actually, because it's the preface of what's going to be a 25 volume work. And the scale of the book is crazy. So the actual, if you ever get a copy of the book, you might have in a library somewhere, but they're this big, they're this thick, they're written in minute writing, with almost no punctuation anywhere. But it's a phenomenal work, and in the preface, the one I've translated so far, I've got a copy just here. It's not that thin. It includes a whole history of all known astronomy at the time, up to 1651, all the biographies of all the known astronomers, and a full summary of the problems in astronomy in the 17th century. So even translating the preface was quite a substantial piece of work. I had to do a lot of research to actually try and understand who the various figures were, so I could put various notes on that. Which I feel gave me a pretty decent background and understanding of some of these things. But it's a constant learning curve. I'm learning more and more every day, and more while translating this book. A lot of the stuff in this book is unknown to historians of science because they haven't translated it, and it hasn't been read in whole since probably maybe the 18th century. So it's. Wow. There's a lot in there that we can learn from.
It's almost surprising that such a prominent textbook wouldn't have a translation. But I suppose this is some of the interest behind the history of science is just like war, there's a survivorship bias of the theories that we come to know today, and then the ones that are competing at the time in history sort of fade off into the distance.
Yeah, a lot of ideas of the time, and the ideas of Riccioli, for example, some of them were at a dead end, essentially, in science history. And while his textbook was prominent still in the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, he was cited by a lot of people. But that changed over time. People were learning new physics, new astronomy, and this was all defunct, old. They had new ways of doing it. They didn't need to look into this so much anymore. And what was remembered from history was, the key bits. So if you try and kind of, if most historians, well, not historians, most physicists or astronomers who might want to write a history, they would look back linearly on what ideas were used to come up with their theory, and they would probably not spend so much time talking about the people who had other ideas and were wrong, or might have been right for a bit but turned out to be wrong, or anything like that. But there is an awful amount of irony in the period, and it's frankly really, really fascinating to look at some of these oddities in the history of science. I think if I ever finish this one, I'll probably translate a few other weird ones. There's a Fracastoro from the 16th century who had a completely different theory, a homocentric rings theory, and no one's translated it before either. And a lot of works haven't been translated from the period.
Right.
And people make a lot of assumptions. People talk about Gregorian dating being wrong, but people haven't translated all the documents from the making of the Gregorian calendar. So how do they know? It's all quite fascinating.
I think one of the interesting perspectives this gives is it gives a more human context for some of these thinkers that we just sort of assume, well, why did it take so long for people to accept that the Earth orbits the sun, for instance? And by exploring some of these competing theories, it shows why there's some resistance for thinking certain ways, and why certain observations aren't just conclusive proof of a certain phenomena. So, and this sort of leads into the Galileo Affair, and what typical people have wrong about Galileo, myself included. I'm very confused about why this narrative of Galileo became misconstrued in the first place. And I suppose the typical narrative that most people learned, myself included, is that Galileo was just a victim of circumstance of the time. He had some evidence that supported the sun-centered universe, the heliocentric model, with his phases of Venus and moons of Jupiter, for instance. And this radically opposed that view held by the Roman Catholic Church of the 17th century, which supported the Earth-centered universe. And he found himself caught in this battle between science and religion. He was persecuted accordingly for his scientific viewpoints, which led to the censorship of all of his work and a sentence of house arrest, where he spent the remaining part of his days in isolation, desolation, ultimately thinking he probably was going to be completely forgotten in the shadows of history. So that's the narrative that I think most of us came to know about Galileo. So which part of this story is wrong, and why would it be made up in the first place?
Okay, so let's perhaps start with talking about how and why this kind of narrative was made up. And to get an understanding of that, you need to have a broader understanding of European history. Everything is in context. And the period after Galileo was quite interesting. Sorry?
1650 or 16...
So Galileo, he was 1564, 1642 was his death. And Europe was in turmoil already at that point, right? So there was the Protestant schism, and there was a lot of warfare because of the various schisms. The English Reformation had happened, so there was a lot of opposition to the church already at that point, and Europe became more anti-clerical, anti-Catholic in the coming centuries after that. So you can look at, for example, the Napoleonic era, and at this point is actually probably where Galileo started to become politically interesting. He was perhaps known amongst astronomers and physicists, but he wasn't revered as much as we revere him today. He was still a considerable figure, but not as major a figure as we make him out to be now. But in the late start of the 19th century, he became really interesting because this was a figure that could be promoted, that could be used to build an anti-Catholic narrative. And Napoleon did this. So Napoleon invaded Rome in 1798, right? And interestingly, he actually stole all the Vatican archives and he took them back to Paris. And the convoy to take all these archives was, miles long. And he had a group of people investigate the Galileo Affair to see, let's uncover anything embarrassing about the church at the time. Intriguingly, they actually, in the end, discovered or thought that the whole cause of the 1633 trial was because of the Simplicio analogy, which I'll come back to later. But that's actually disputed by the historians of today. But there's a possibility we actually lost some documents while Napoleon was stealing all the archives, and not all of them made it back because it was actually really costly to steal all those archives. And when he returned them a few decades later, not all of it was returned because it was too expensive to take back because, a lot of commoners would have taken the paper and used it as toilet paper and so on, right? So, and things continued this way. So there was continued anti-Catholic movements throughout Europe. We have the uprisings in 1830 across all of Europe, and this was the kind of Freemasonic or enlightened groups of people who saw a kind of brighter future in a way without a church. So that kind of idea, right? And we have the unification of Italy. So Garibaldi unified Italy, and that sounds all pleasant and stuff, but how did he unify it? By killing lots of people and invading, taking over a whole country forcefully, right? So Rome was captured in 1849, then freed again by the French, I believe, and then recaptured in 1870 by Garibaldi's forces. So there was a constant anti-Catholic movement, and the same goes in the ideology behind it, right? So of course there was the victory of heliocentric thought, and there was a growth in Cartesianism, which was kind of already an opposition to the church in the sense that these were historical slights there. Descartes had been on the index as well. There were the Enlightenment ideas, the ideas of Voltaire. Voltaire created his own Galileo myth. He said he was actually the first person to claim Galileo had proved that the Earth goes around the sun. No one had actually said that before Voltaire. And we have the rise of independent academic societies. So there were a whole variety of people who had it in for the church, right? And they were quite keen on some of these narratives. And it's not necessarily that they had a conspiracy to have a false narrative. It was more the case that if you read things in a certain light, you kind of read what you want to read, right? And that's a lot of what happened at the time. And the story they kind of had is just a really good story, right? This idea of Galileo as a martyr, Galileo who was right and he was opposed to an authority that was wrong, and at the end he said, and yet it moves, which wasn't true either. But it's just a really good story, and people love that kind of story, and it's a very messianic story, right? It's the story of Christ. It's the story of Socrates. It hits you, right? So it when it's a good story, it's quite easy to propagate it.
That's right.
And all of this is intertwined with something called I don't know if you know about this, but the conflict thesis. So this was started by Washington Irving in his 1828 History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. And this was a fictional kind of drama of historical drama. And in it, he claimed, Columbus was the one that proved that the world was round. The church opposed him. They all thought it was flat. And all of this was frankly untrue.
This was a very common narrative that I was taught early on, and I was way too late in life before I really looked into that. I was always confused of how did this narrative of Columbus discovering the Earth being round
even
originate?
So, intriguingly, I mean, Europeans had known the world was a sphere since antiquity, right?
That's right.
And in Christian thought, this was all the way through. So Gregory of Nyssa, 3rd, 4th century writer, Earth is round, right? Then you've got Augustine, Earth is round. Bede, Earth is round. Same with Aquinas. There were perhaps a few people who thought it was flat, but they would be in a minority, and they wouldn't be key figures in the history of Christianity. Washington Irving built this drama, very popular drama, and it was followed up by the works of John William Draper in 1874 and Andrew Dixon White's. They wrote the history of the conflict between religion and science and the warfare of science. And these were very direct, the first books claiming that there was a conflict between religion and science in general. These things, they directly sourced Washington Irving as if he was a historical source, which, he'd written.
He was a fiction writer,
yeah. And they did the same for other texts. They wrote things that were wrong about Galileo and so on, just to push this theory of this conflict. And I can't say if they were being intentionally controversial or whether it's just what was already available at the time in terms of what people were saying about things. But these kinds of things started to stick. What happened afterwards is when things are told one way already and they become popular, it's just repeated over and over again, right? So Bertolt Brecht's play from 1955, his Galileo play, similarly lots of errors, but popular. He actually didn't want to claim there was a conflict between religion and science. He just thought there was. He wanted to portray the conflict of science and authority in general. But similarly, hugely popular, spreading varieties of myths. And there were also the opposite kinds of myths. So there were reactionary myths. There were people who were saying, "Well, what these people are saying is wrong," and they were going the other way, right? So you have someone like Jacques Mallet du Pan, French author, 1749 to 1800. He claimed, for example, that Galileo was a bad theologian, and that's what caused the issues. But that isn't true either, because Galileo's theology was actually good. It was actually eventually accepted by Pope Leo XIII as the theology that should be considered around the fact that heliocentrism was considered true at the time, right? And then you have people like Adolf Müller or Koestler who wrote essentially libel against Galileo. They had a lot of anger to him. They said he caused all sorts of issues, and actually he was the bigger problem, and so on. And the truth is a kind of middle ground, and it's quite nuanced, and it's quite subtle, and it's quite hard to understand everything, and hard to get it across as well. And even if we do know everything that's there, we don't. We can't know what people's intentions were entirely. We can kind of guess at them or try and figure that out. But there are a lot of unknowns, right? And I'm going to try and be clear about the various unknowns while we talk about this, because they can make a difference, right?
That's right.
And sorry, I'll just finish this off. So
no, please.
Based on all of this, all of these various myths, they became part and parcel of textbooks. I mean, they were already in encyclopedias, starting with D'Alembert, who wrote the myth and put it in an encyclopedia. And from then on, any textbook was sourcing on previous texts that were wrong, and you get things that are getting worse and worse in terms of propagation because they're just repeating the same. And once you've got 100 sources that say the same thing, how do you deal with that, right? Looking forwards, I wonder whether any of these myths will be conquered in the popular realm, because frankly, the only way you could do that is through some form of censorship, right? And that would kind of defeat the purpose of trying to learn everything we can from the case. So
That's right.
It's a tough challenge, and Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I wanted to explore this topic a little more, because I suppose it's easy for us as humans to gravitate towards these stories that have very clear definitions of right and wrong and black and white. But the reality of almost all topics is much more nuanced, and there's a lot more gray than people like to believe.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose just in the typical narrative of the history of the Earth, one of the holes in the story that I always thought was interesting is that Copernicus, who predated Galileo by perhaps maybe 50 years or so, he was one of the pioneers of the heliocentric model as we were taught. And so he predated Galileo, but he was never put on trial by the church, and he wasn't harassed by the church as Galileo. Why is that?
So this is quite a surprising part of the story. So Copernicus was actually supported by the church in his time, and a lot of people are really surprised by this, because this isn't what they're taught about Copernicus either.
Because it conflicts with the narrative of Galileo, right?
Partly yes. Partly yes. Partly that, and I'm not sure what else is. Maybe it is just that. Yeah. Anyway, but Copernicus released his first publication in terms of heliocentric works in 1514, and he didn't publish it publicly. He kind of sent it around amongst his friends. But anyone in academia knew there was this dude he's moved off to Poland, and he believes the sun's at the center. And we know people knew that because Rheticus was sent there to try and get Copernicus to publish his well-awaited book, because in the Commentariolus he suggests that he can publish a really accurate heliocentric work, and he didn't do that for another 30 years, right? So it's right. They kind of thought it would be published, and it wasn't published for a while. And Rheticus came over there and said, we should try and get this published. And but before he published, we actually have records of Pope Clement VII suggesting he approved heliocentric theory, because he asked his secretary, Johann Widmanstatter, to give a lecture on heliocentrism in the Vatican grounds, right? So that's quite an unusual thing. And the first thing, he must have been quite interested in it already. And when he gave the lecture, the Pope was impressed, and he gave him a gift. And Cardinal Schönberg, as a result, who was a kind of right-hand man who'd been sent out to deal with negotiating peace between nations and stuff like that. So he was a big figure in the church hierarchy. He sent a letter to Copernicus offering him money for an advanced copy of De Revolutionibus. And Copernicus attached this letter in the preface to De Revolutionibus, along with a statement saying that his own friend bishop, the archbishop, sorry, not archbishop, he was just a bishop, Bishop Tiedemann Gies, had actually been one of the ones who'd persuaded him to publish. And I think Gies was certainly one who was persuading him to publish, but certainly Rheticus arriving there helped him to decide to do that as well, because Rheticus published the Narratio Prima the year before, and that was quite successful, so they knew they could go ahead with De Revolutionibus. And why did Copernicus wait so long to publish? A lot of people say something along the lines of, he was, waiting till he was on his deathbed to publish it because he was afraid that people would, the church would harass him or anything like that. But we know the church wasn't harassing him. His own, the full line of superiors up to the Pope were in support of him. And so why did he wait so long? Why did he not publish? And there's a few different theories about that. What we do know is between Commentariolus and De Revolutionibus, he had added 10 epicycles. And this is quite a strange thing because a lot of people think that Copernicus used fewer epicycles than the Ptolemaic system, but it's actually not true. Ptolemy used 34, and there weren't really any added before Copernicus. Copernicus used 38 epicycles.
These epicycles, they believed the orbits to be perfect circles, and then these epicycles were the spinning smaller circles within the larger orbit. And this was
exactly, yes,
what they had to use to explain the planetary motion. That's correct?
Exactly. So if you want to explain retrograde motion, you need the planet going in the other way at some points to the rest of the stars. And the one way you could explain that is by having a circle on a circle. So when one circle's going forwards and the other one's going back, the backward motion could actually be greater than the forward motion otherwise, right?
Right.
And Copernicus had added 10 since Commentariolus, so he had 48 in De Revolutionibus. And he didn't do this just because he was trying to fix things, but perhaps he was trying to make his model more accurate. He wasn't happy enough with how inaccurate it was, but he was intentionally adding them as well. So he was intentionally adding circular motion, which was considered perfect at the time. The idea that you could have a perfect motion was it would either be in a circle or in a perfectly straight line. And celestial objects were considered to be made of ether, and they should be perfect in every way. So it all tied into these cosmological ideas. So he replaced the equant, which was I don't know if I should go into this, but the equant was a problem of the Ptolemaic model. It was a point on the other side, a bit further from the Earth, because the Earth wasn't actually in the center in the Ptolemaic model. It was just slightly off. It was on an eccentric, so it was slightly off the center of what things actually orbited. And on the other side of the eccentric was the equant, and the equant essentially acted as a point around which planets moved in a regular motion. That was the kind of idea. And actually, if you think about it, this kind of adds up to, it's similar to what Kepler came up with his laws, right? With planets sweeping equal areas as they go through the ellipse. It's right. Quite similar. It's I don't think it's exact, but it comes to a similar conclusion. So Copernicus replaced the equant with a 2Z couple, which requires two circles, to which one is on the other, and actually you can get a straight a linear motion using two circles. So he was adding these intentionally. So even after Copernicus, this was taken up quite well. The Jesuits were spreading Copernicus's theory across the whole world. An oddity is actually the first ban of Copernicanism was Japan's ban in 1613. It was the Tokugawa shogunate. They were banning all Christianity at the point because they considered them dangerous. They were interfering in their politics. I don't know if you've been watching, what's this new show? There's a new show, I can't remember what it's called now, but this talks
on Netflix,
about...
Netflix, or which one is it?
It's definitely on Prime, because it's on Disney even.
Not sure if
I'll come back to it later if I remember.
Sure.
But this was the period of the rising of the Tokugawa shogunate, and they repressed all Christian thought, and part of that was actually heliocentrism as well. So Japan actually adopted heliocentrism a lot later than a lot of the rest of the world as a result.
So you're telling me that the Jesuits, who were it's a sect of the Roman Catholic Church, was actually involved with spreading heliocentrism.
Yeah, I wouldn't call them a sect. They're an order within the Catholic Church.
Thank you.
So a sect would be kind of someone who's slightly dodgy. I mean,
sure.
They're an order. The Jesuits actually originally formed, and they had these vows where they would be directly subservient to the Pope. So they were the kind of almost the elite Catholic group, the very papal Catholics, and right. they were for sure trying to evangelize these various countries using the various knowledge they had. Astronomical knowledge was one of it. They were using this knowledge to gain entry to the various courts, to the Japanese court, to the Chinese court, and so on. So in China, Matteo Ricci was teaching heliocentric theory, and this was a way to show a superiority, or we can teach you things, and this is why you should work with us, right? And this isn't saying that they believed that heliocentrism was real, because one of the things that had happened is Copernicus's publisher, Andreas Osiander, he had added an additional preface to the Revolutionibus, in which he said, this is just a mathematical tool. It's not actually reality. It's something that you can use to calculate the positions of the planets, to save the appearances of the celestial bodies. So this is kind of how it was accepted. And this was already a standard, because most astronomers of the time didn't believe in the Ptolemaic system exactly. That was also considered a mathematical tool, because they had an Aristotelian cosmology, and the Ptolemaic model was almost considered something that would it wasn't quite right, but if it was improved enough, it might be similar enough to the Aristotelian cosmology they actually believed in, right? So they were already working on a theory of everything, and there was a bit of a clash between Aristotelian physics and Aristotelian thought with combined with Ptolemaic theory, right? So this was quite an accepted standard already.
So the Aristotelian thought was everything is moving just perfectly around Earth.
So it includes a lot of things. So it's not just that. It's also, the elements, earth, water, wind, fire. It links into various theories about biology, about how things move, and so on, right? So it's quite a considerable cosmology that was essentially a unification of philosophy. It was a theory of everything of its time. And they wanted everything to be consistent. And when things weren't quite right, they believed that there was probably a way it could be unified, but they're just not quite there yet, right? This is probably quite familiar for contemporary scientists.
One of these key elements to this story is that it seems that the Roman Catholic Church was actively involved in disseminating the scientific knowledge of the era, which doesn't seem to be like an anti-science position. Is that a correct assessment? So
to make it clear that the church was really entwined in the scientific process. They had essentially formed the university system across Europe. The spread of knowledge across Europe was actually really well orchestrated, and it actually existed before the university system as well. Monasteries had kept the knowledge of the ancients through some rough times, the warfare in the Middle Ages, through copying books and sharing knowledge across these huge networks of monasteries across all of Europe. So this was already the kind of knowledge sphere was already something that had really been created by the church. The university system belonged to them entirely. Some of it was starting to be stolen. Obviously, the Reformation meant that the English universities were stolen from the clutch of Catholic hands, and the same happened later in the French Revolution.
When was the Reformation?
The 1530. To check that. So it would be around the time of Copernicus. But a while before Galileo.
And this was one of the major splits in the church.
It was England, right? So it was solely England at the time. England didn't have their empire yet so much. But the same thing was eventually happened in the rest of Europe as well, right? So the French Revolution took away Catholic property in France. The unification of Italy secularized all the Catholic institutions across Italy, and so on, right?
Right.
And the rise of Protestantism in Northern Europe similarly meant things were taken over by Lutherans or Calvinists and so on. Right, but that's not to say that they didn't have their own academic networks then afterwards either. King Henry VIII stole these various things. He destroyed a lot of things as well. He destroyed many monasteries. He destroyed many universities. But he also built Trinity College, which eventually had Newton. So I wouldn't say it was a net positive, but there were some positives. I
see.
Yeah. But it wasn't just the university system. So the church also ran something called the imprimatur system. So an imprimatur was something like a peer review, except your peer reviewer was likely to be a theologian. So you'd probably have your, so books were very expensive to publish at the time, and a huge amount of work goes into them. If you ever look at a medieval text or a early modern text, you'll be impressed at the quality of the book, because they had to be good quality to be worth publishing, and it would be checked by other scientists. It would be checked by theologians who would give the imprimatur, and that could be a bishop as well. And the imprimatur essentially said, so there were actually two different things. You could have nihil obstat, which means there's nothing wrong with this book, or an imprimatur, which was a kind of more direct claim that everything in this book is actually good. So to get a book published and sold in church buildings, you'd want to have an imprimatur for people to know that it was quality approved. But the imprimaturs weren't being used everywhere, of course, because Protestant countries were not looking for Catholic imprimaturs, and the printing press was growing at a fast rate. So Venice had a huge amount of printing presses, and they weren't necessarily so keen on having to have imprimaturs on everything, because there was a lot of hassle and so on.
Right.
And then the church also had the index. So this was the index of forbidden books. Everyone knows about this one, right?
Right. The forbidden books. So
this was clearly a response to the growing printing press, the growing amount of books that could be dangerous or erroneous, and people considered that ideas could be dangerous at the time. They were worried that new ideas, they might cause more schism and therefore more warfare across Europe. So people were very worried about. Did
this include scientific work, or was it theological, or a mix of everything?
Mostly theological works up until the Galileo Affair, essentially. Right. I think there might have been one book that was there before John Johnson's book on. I don't know the story of that too much, but pretty much all the books would have been there if they had theological error, and there were some translations of the Bible, some books by people who had, taken Jewish thought and tried to apply it to something, and a variety of things like that, right?
Right. And so was this controlled by the Inquisition, or who actually was responsible for this? This is good, and this is bad.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I entirely know this, but there was certainly the Inquisition could put things on the index. You got to remember that there was not just one Inquisition and not just one index either, because there were initially a variety of indexes, and then a pope standardized the index, but even that wasn't standard across all of Europe. You had the Spanish Inquisition, you had the Roman Inquisition, you had a Polish Inquisition, and they didn't always get along with each other. They had their own indices, and they didn't necessarily conform. So the Spanish Inquisition, for example, never added Galileo's works to their index because they considered the 1633 Roman index to be anti-Spanish because it included some Spanish works. It's there's a lot of detail in there, a lot, and there were worries by various nations about, for example, the Pope's influence, because the Pope not only was in charge of the church, but he was also in charge of the Papal States, which for them was essentially a rival country as well, right? So there was, you could say, a conflict of interest that made them worried about decisions that he was making. And if he was being anti-Spanish, then that's not good either, right?
Right.
And yeah, the church had funded astronomers. They had funded people for making the Gregorian calendar. Do you know about the Gregorian calendar?
You can enlighten me a little more.
So before the Gregorian calendar, Europeans had used the Julian calendar. And the problem with the Julian calendar is this was what was set up by Julius Caesar, under Julius Caesar. He wasn't an astronomer himself. But it was a fairly good calendar, but it just calculated. I think it had the leap year, right, with one additional day, but then it didn't account for the variety of decimal points after that. And by the time of the 16th century, spring equinox in the calendar was vastly different from the spring equinox in reality. And this was, for the church, this was important because they wanted Easter to be calculatable from the actual spring equinox. And they were using a calendar that was putting it quite far out where the actual spring equinox was. And this was a bit of an embarrassment. So they eventually got Lilius, who had built this concept of the Gregorian calendar. They accepted this and they pushed it out across as much of the world as they could to try and make sure that they could get the date of Easter right. So they'd been hiring astronomers, and astronomers were quite desired at the time because the age of sail had happened. To calculate your latitude and longitude, you needed good astronomers to be able to do that. So astronomy was improving, and the church was certainly funding it. And after the Gregorian calendar, you have Clavius, who reformed the Jesuits and turned them into a scientific powerhouse. So before Clavius, there wasn't really anything like it, but Clavius made it a priority to make Jesuits really well educated in mathematics, in astronomy, and in the other sciences. And this is actually what transformed the Jesuit movement as well, and what allowed them to get access to China, to Japan, to these various places that, really appreciated the knowledge that they were bringing on their expeditions. And then there was astrology. I mean, this is the other thing people forget. In this kind of time, astrology was... zodiacs, astrology and horoscopes were a big part of how things worked. So
I suppose with astrology, there's perhaps two viewpoints, right? There's the mapping of the night sky throughout the year, but then there's also the element of it predicts your mood and your future wealth and well-being. So is this something that the Roman Catholic Church supported, or how does this interplay?
So this is fascinating because you could probably have a whole conversation on this alone. But in short, the church from quite an early point didn't like the concept of astrology due to the fact that they believed in free will, and that therefore you couldn't have everything in your future decided by the stars, right? And then the Catholic Church made some distinctions, such as the distinction of something called judicial and natural astrology. So judicial astrology was the kind of thing where it was a horoscope. You should do this on this and this day because it's auspicious, or horoscope saying there's your character's like this and this and this because you were born under this and this star. And judicial astrology was condemned in a variety of places, but still used by a variety of people who still thought, well, I'm not sure if it works, but best check anyway, kind of attitude. And then natural astrology was related to medicine. So actually, medicinal astrology lasted up to probably the start of the 19th century. It's surprisingly late how long it was used. But the idea that certain phases of the moon would be better for bloodletting or anything like that was all ingrained into medical science at the time. And the same with and other parts of natural astrology actually made it into the science of today. So the tides, for example, are one. That was considered astrology, right? Or frankly, the seasons. I mean, that was astrology as well. Was the fact that something in the heavens affected the earth, and the equinox and the equinox or whatever the seasons meant. Your crops are growing, or it was cold, and so on. And the tides also relied on celestial objects, so that was considered astrology then. Whereas now, we know that's the gravitational effects and so on. But
but they make correlations to the moon.
Exactly, and actually, there's an oddity there as well, in that Galileo, for example, rejected the concept that the moon affected the tides because he saw it as a kind of occult idea, and he wanted to be this nice humanist who just had very scientific, logical thoughts that didn't have such, woo-woo ideas in it. And he was wrong. And only thanks to Newton, we could actually get back to that reasoning where we could explain why.
What was Galileo's take on why there's high and low tide?
So Galileo had this theory that that the tides were caused by the fact that the side of the Earth that was closer to the sun was traveling slower than the one on the outer edge, which was obviously going on a bigger circular path. At the time, it was on the outer edge, and that this caused a kind of swish-swashing of the waters across the Earth, and then ended up with the tides. And then he had theories.
So he used this to support his heliocentric.
Exactly. So he was
model.
Convinced by this that heliocentrism was true. And this is a fascinating thing. He had, his tide theory was wrong, but it was probably the thing that drove him to believe it.
Interesting. And so he was basically right for the wrong reasons.
Yes, and this happens so often in science. People right for the wrong reasons or wrong for the right reasons. And in the terms of the tide theory, you can see why he would be shot down about it, because any sailor of the time would have had his own tide charts, which were already pretty good. It was based on the moon, and they knew that the moon affected the tides because they'd been using the tide charts for a while. There were very good medieval tide charts even. So it was a step back ultimately.
Right. So I mean, but Galileo did have some observations that were consistent with a heliocentric model that do agree with the Earth going around the sun. And one of these that I had mentioned is the phases of Venus, which the Ptolemaic model of the epicycles of the planets going around the Earth, it doesn't give the full spectrum of the phases of Venus, for instance. So how could this be rectified? Why would this not be supporting evidence that geocentrism is not a thing?
Yeah. So to be clear, Galileo had 5 main points that he argued for in his dialogue of the two models, right? So the theory of the tides, and we know that was wrong.
That's right.
Then you had the phases of Venus. Now, the phases of Venus, they discredited the Ptolemaic model, because in the Ptolemaic model, Venus was within the circle of the sun, so it wasn't going around the sun, so it couldn't actually have the phases where it was actually rounder and so on.
That's right.
Then because it wasn't going behind the sun. But the Ptolemaic theory, by the time of Galileo, wasn't that popular anymore anyway. So the scientific consensus actually at the time was for the Tychonic model. This was created by, the Tychonic model by Tycho Brahe, I've
heard various pronunciations. Is it Tycho?
It should really be Tycho, but I always forget. It's too easy to do it wrong. Tycho Brahe he ran a huge observatory. He had his own island, and he got everyone on the island who were his serfs to work for him to build his observatory, to do various works on it. He
sounds like Elon Musk at the time or something.
well, this is it. He was actually his observatory was similar comparable in scale to NASA today. It was a huge project. Wow. He was actually receiving 1% of the Danish tax funds on top of what he was getting from his serfs on his island, and he had enough furnaces in his observatory to equip an army every year if he wanted to. But he was churning out astronomical equipment and observing the stars, and he built a huge catalog. And so he was really popular. He was also an aristocrat, so he had his connections, and he wrote to essentially all the astronomers, anyone of note throughout Europe, and he persuaded them of his model. And it's not just that he was persuasive, but people were already, he was putting pen to paper an idea that people had already kind of adopted. So the Tychonic model is actually the Copernican model from the reference frame of a stationary Earth, right? So if you
mind elaborating a little bit?
So in it, the Earth is at the center, and the sun rotates around the Earth, and then all the other planets rotate around the sun. And you could arrive at this by imagining the heliocentric model and just kind of jumping on Earth and observing from Earth's point of view.
So Earth is still not rotating, but it's the
exactly.
sun.
But it's mathematically entirely equivalent. There's the mathematics is entirely the same, and people were already, in a way, supporting this, because all the people who had been using the Copernican model since 1543, and people who had adopted the Prutenic tables, which were the latest tables, the only tables available. So tables had kind of more. Tables weren't a model; they had actual predictions of actual positions of various planets, and the Prutenic tables were the only tables to exist since the Alphonsine tables, which were about 300 years earlier. So the Prutenic tables were the latest tables. If you wanted to use them, you were essentially using the Copernican model, but people weren't considering Copernicus's model to be real. They still thought the Earth was at the center. So what they were actually doing is they were using a Tychonic model in a sense, because they were using the Copernican model and thinking the Earth was at the center, right? So when he made his model, they'd already been doing that, right? Now there were some people who were persuaded by Copernicus before then, but that was still a minority. It was not the majority. And Tycho was persuasive, and then with the phases of Venus, all hope in the Ptolemaic model evaporated. And what you can do with the Ptolemaic model is because it works on ratios, right? The ratio between the definite and the epicycle. If you scale that up, you can essentially get back the Tychonic model by scaling up to the point where Venus rotates around the sun again. And there was also another model, the Capellan model, which had actually existed since the 4th century, and that was a bit like the Tychonic model, but it only had Mercury and Venus and sometimes Mars going around the sun, but the other planets were going around the Earth. So there was a historic similar model that had existed before as well. So the phases of Venus can be accounted for in a Tychonic model, and because it held the scientific consensus.
And the phases of Venus. So that would explain the Galileo's argument there.
Exactly. So yeah. What Galileo's phases of Venus did support heliocentrism, but they didn't discredit geocentrism, because geocentrism could still work under the Tychonic or the Capellan models. So then we have Jupiter's moons, and Jupiter's moons weren't actually evidence of any model. No model.
It was just circumstantial type.
Exactly. They didn't have moons already in any model. And you look at someone like George Loker, who was an astronomer who wrote a long list of arguments against heliocentrism. And one of the things he said, well, actually, the moons of Jupiter, what are they? They are evidence that epicycles exist. Because what you have is Jupiter, and you see that there are things going around it. So they are actually on an epicycle.
In a circle.
Yeah.
They're going in a circle along a much larger circle, which is like an epicycle.
Exactly, yeah. Then we have sunspots and lunar craters. And these are intriguing because one thing that they do start to do is
these are observations that Galileo also made, right?
Yeah, so he made
spots,
yeah, exactly. So
and the moon craters,
lunar craters, and these are intriguing because these start to discredit Aristotelian cosmology, which is actually probably something bigger than discrediting geocentric models. Because if you start discrediting Aristotelian cosmology, that's the whole theory of everything of the time, right? If you drop that, then what's left? So why does it discredit it? So Aristotelian thought was that celestial objects were perfect. And there were various theories, for example, so that maybe that the moon emanates its own light. And here was clear evidence that it was shadows. Here was clear evidence there was sunspots, so the sun wasn't perfect. And this was damaging to Aristotelian cosmology, but it wasn't damaging to geocentric ideas, because sunspots, even though they do rotate round, but that can be accounted for by a spinning sun. It doesn't require a movement of the Earth, and the lunar craters are just a feature of the moon, and that doesn't change anything, right? So these were the main arguments, and then Galileo, he also talked about kind of concept of relativity. If you drop a cannonball on the boat, if you're moving, it still falls down. So, but these were kind of not evidence of anything. These were just kind of arguments saying that that dropping things, that kind of lack of feeling of motion was compatible with a spinning Earth, right? But there was just no proof. So people could felt that there was no movement of the Earth, so they had no reason to start believing that it was spinning at pretty crazy speeds and traveling at crazy speeds through the universe. They thought that if it did, they should be able to feel that, because if you're on a horse and you don't even go very fast, you can feel it, can't you?
That's right. Well, this is a hang up for some of the modern conspiracies of today as well. They can't feel the Earth moving, and it's not moving.
Yeah, and yes,
it's a difficult thing to measure.
Yeah, and you need to start doing some maths before you can actually show why it is the way it is, and why we believe in the various movements and motions and so on. And it's not something you can easily do to someone who's just going to say things just verbally on Twitter, right? And make assertions without actually doing any calculations or anything like that. And a huge part of science, if you want to actually promote a theory, is you need to start making predictions, right?
That's right.
You need to have a model that is actually comparable to the other models or better than, before you should really be taken seriously, right? The Copernican model was comparable. It wasn't much better than the Ptolemaic model. It was perhaps a bit better, but the tables were less stale. And frankly, if you picked a planet and you measured its position, it was a kind of a roll of a dice as to whether the Copernican or the Ptolemaic model would have predicted the position better. What was better was Kepler's model. So Kepler had actually made his model before Galileo's affair started at all, and it's quite unfortunate that Galileo ignored Kepler.
Kepler is always presented, usually in a broad overview. He's always presented as just a follower that came after Galileo, but they were actually contemporaries.
Yes, and Kepler died first. Kepler wrote his major works first, and I can kind of understand why Galileo ignored his works, because I don't know if you've read them, but they're quite difficult. And he has all these weird ideas. So in his Cosmographia, he talks about Platonic solids, and he figures out, well, there's 5 planets, there's 5 Platonic solids. There must be a relation. There must be some kind of way they join together. And he thought that the Platonic solids positions could explain the various distances between the planets. And then in his Harmonicas Mundi, he came up with the concept that there should be kind of musical relations between the various planet positions or orbits. And that they would have these harmonics between them. And this it sounds kind of bizarre now, but it's, you know, I always compare it to the string theorists. That, you know, they're similarly bizarre. But so his works were quite difficult from the perspective of having quite a few weird ideas and also being very mathematical and dense with maths. And you know, the guy was a genius. He was probably the star. He should really be the real star of the early 17th century.
Right. Because, well, he was, if I'm correct, he was the first one to do away with these epicycle orbits altogether, right? And he had these generalized elliptical orbits. It also explained orbiting of comets, or comets, common knowledge. I mean, like a generalized orbit path for an object.
So Kepler had the ellipses, and ellipses can account for a variety of comets, because if comets are still within, if they're within the gravitational well of the sun, then they still follow an elliptical path, right? What it couldn't still explain was the hyperbolic paths of objects that might pass through the solar system without being stuck in a gravitational well. And that came a bit later. There's Ismail Boulio, who came up with the idea of conics, and conics, if you take a direct vertical slice of a cone, then you get a hyperbolic trajectory. So actually any kind of orbit is essentially can be estimated as a conic section.
A slice through a cone, conic section. Right.
Let's try and be accurate here, because you know, with all the various interferences of various things, this becomes less true as through time, as science matured later. But as an average, and actually elliptical orbits were, I don't know if they're still used in planetary modeling these days, but they were used for a very long time. And the way you would calculate the position of planets is you'd have your baseline elliptical orbits, and then you'd just calculate deviations from it. And this is how Leverrier calculated the position of Neptune.
So Galileo essentially ignored Kepler on purpose, or just thought he was a competing scientist that he wanted to. He was a competing scientist that just wanted to take the credit for. Or?
So yeah, I've heard a few different theories for this, and I haven't found any that I think is something that I can jump behind and say that's absolutely true. That there are a few different ways to think about it. One is perhaps his books were just too difficult for Galileo. Two, maybe he just never got around to opening the books. He was busy on his stuff. Three, maybe he did. Maybe he did see Kepler as an opponent, someone that was challenging him, and Galileo had figured out how to get his fame from his telescopic observations, and he didn't want anyone else to beat him to it. That's another theory that some people have stated, but I don't think there's clear evidence for any of them. So we just don't know. We don't know entirely. What we do know is Kepler had a tide theory, and Galileo referred to Kepler's tide theory as a cult. So we know that he at least considered some of Kepler's works a cult.
He was aware of them.
Yeah, they wrote to each other a brief amount, and then Kepler wrote more to Galileo, and Galileo ignored him. So that was the kind of relationship they had.
Interesting. So Galileo developed his theory with these 5 chief arguments of heliocentrism. And then why was there such an adverse reaction of the Roman Catholic Church to his theory? What were some of the events that led to his trial in 1633? And perhaps this is a loaded question, but what is the thing that people get wrong about this?
Okay, so we'll go through all the events that we know about, and I'll discuss some of the complexities there as well, things that we're unsure about. Because I want to be clear, and I want to present what we know. And I don't want to make any just broad statements. You can come to your own conclusions, and they might not be the same as mine. I've actually changed my position on some of the things a few times just because you read something else and then it persuades you about something. And
Right.
it's I always find this interesting. I hear that other historians of science are the same. They sometimes change their mind about some of the details, but the broad view is pretty consistent amongst historians of science at this point. So Galileo didn't really have any issue with any of his observations that he'd made, right? So all the observations he made were actually corroborated by Jesuit astronomers, often the same year that he observed them. So, he, for example, he had his own manuscript where he'd written about Jesuit observations of Jupiter's moons, which were from the same year that he published about them. So we know that he knew about them. He was probably talking to them, working with them to some extent. Where it all really started was with a letter he wrote to one of his followers, Benedetto Castelli. And he initially wrote it to Castelli, but then he expanded it further and wrote a longer letter, and he named it the letter to Duchess Christina. It was the Duchess of the great of Tuscany, essentially. So there was a Grand Duke of Tuscany, and that's who he wrote it to. So in it, he was quite aggressive towards Aristotelian scholars of the time. There was Della Colomba. He called him Pigeon because his name can mean pigeon, and well, it could mean dove, and he kind of called him a pigeon as a joke. And he had his own followers, and Galileo called them the Pigeon League, and he criticized them heavily. In this letter,
Pigeon League.
Exactly, he criticized them heavily, and in this letter, he also referred to Scripture. There are a few minor passages in Scripture that suggests that perhaps Scripture is geocentric, and he was saying that. So, for example, there's this one case where in the Scripture passage, it is said that the sun stopped in the sky. So the geocentric kind of interpretation of this was, well, this shows that the Earth doesn't move because the sun was moving and then it stopped in the sky. That's what Scripture says. Whereas Galileo says, well, there's no conflict actually. It's just from the reference point of the Earth, and surely it would be a lot easier to stop the Earth spinning for one moment than to stop a celestial object like the sun from moving in its perfect orbit. So he was saying things like this.
So this was like a reinterpretation
exactly
of the church's scripture.
Yeah, and in Galileo's view, Galileo didn't believe there was any conflict between scripture and heliocentrism, and he was trying to show this. Now, the others didn't necessarily agree with him. And the Pigeon League saw this letter, and they thought, well, we've got him. We can he's our rival in the university. We can get him for this, and we can all the times he slighted us, we can get him back for this. And they took him to the inquisitorial court, and Galileo clearly knew that this letter was a bit naughty, because in 2018, this is how late we're actually discovering some of these things. In 2018, we discovered Galileo had toned down a copy of the letter that he took with him to Rome to present to the Inquisition, to try and claim that the other versions that he'd actually written were wrong and were kind of made to be more aggressive than he had initially written. But he'd done the opposite. He'd written quite an aggressive letter, and then he got a toned down version and brought it to the Inquisition to try and pretend that he'd actually been
discovery,
good boy.
Like 6 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So we're discovering a lot of things now.
Wow.
Even at the time, so he went to Rome for this. He'd actually been advised not to go to Rome over this investigation that the Inquisition was doing by the court people in the Grand Duke's court. He'd been told, don't go. There's no point getting involved in this. But he went to Rome. He wanted to. I think he perhaps did think that he could persuade the Pope and the people in Rome that he was right, that heliocentrism was true, and that it should be adopted by the church. Now, Piero Giucardini. Yeah, sorry.
What year was this? This was not his.
16. So the investigation started in 1615 and then finished in 1616.
Okay.
And Piero Giucardini, the ambassador of the Tuscany to Rome, wrote at the time, and he came up with one of the first interesting myths about Galileo. He claimed that Galileo was imprudent, that Galileo was coming and trying to upheave all of Rome and persuade everyone of his heliocentrism, and that this was stupid and he shouldn't do this. And this is kind of interesting because Galileo had a relationship with ambassadors, because one thing that he was doing was he was sending out his telescopes to the various ambassadors to promote his theories in different nations. And this was beneficial to the Duke, because one thing you did with an astronomer is you would have an astronomer to show your scientific superiority over other nations, right? So this was Tuscany's way of saying, well, look at us, we're the best right. at science and so on. We're the most advanced, we're the most progressive peoples. And Piero Giucardini clearly didn't like Galileo. He clearly didn't like him at all. And he spread some of this myth. So this is one of the earliest myths of around Galileo, really. But anyway, so in the Inquisition, they consulted a variety of people. They consulted astronomers actually at the time, and because the astronomers were primarily supporting the Tychonic model, they all said, well, actually, Galileo's wrong. He's got no evidence of heliocentrism, and he is, and there's actually evidence against heliocentrism, because one thing that they had was the prediction that if heliocentrism was true, then there should be stellar parallax. Now, parallax is the kind of idea that if you have two balls, right, and you close one eye, it kind of looks like that, and then if you close the other eye, it looks like that. So things that are far behind each other, they move. And with the heliocentric model, because the Earth was moving, if you were on the opposite side of the Earth in summer than you were in winter, you should be able to start seeing parallax in the stars to the side, right? And this hadn't been measured. And the only way you could explain that was if the stars were further away, but Galileo also measured the diameter of the stars, and it was a very naive form of measurement, because he literally measured the kind of width across his telescope, and Galileo's telescope was probably worse than any telescope you can buy in a toy store.
Right.
And measuring the width naively gave a kind of size of the stars at that extreme distance to stop stellar parallax from happening. It meant that every star was bigger than the known universe at the time. And people considered this to be preposterous, just absolutely silly. Of course, we have discovered huge stars since then, but none of them actually are as big as even the smallest star that Galileo had predicted the size of if this was true. So all of this was presented against him. So that was one thing. And then the Inquisition also consulted, they were called theological qualifiers.
Essentially, sorry to interrupt, but it sounds to me that they were actually being scientifically honest about the heliocentric model in this investigation.
Yes, they certainly. So they put things to an assessment, which is, and they asked astronomers, and we know this happened. We know from a later letter from Galileo to Ingoli, he credits Ingoli with persuading the Inquisition against him, and you can find this translation in Chris Graney's recently translated this in his Setting Aside All Authority book. It's there along with the letter that Galileo wrote to Ingoli, so you can read that all up there. But then the Inquisition also consulted theological qualifiers. Now, the theological qualifiers were clearly very biased. They said that heliocentrism was a heresy. And the Inquisition didn't seem to agree with the qualifiers. They went for a middle ground, or at least what they thought was a middle ground. And they said that what heliocentrism was is that it was false and contrary to scripture. False because there was no evidence to it, and the science seemed to suggest geocentrism was true, and contrary to scripture because it seemed to be not agreeing with what it said in scripture, right?
Right.
Now the difference makes a big difference. If it was a heresy, then it couldn't be taught at all. If it was this, whatever this was, which was something new, false and contrary to scripture, meant that you could still hold heliocentrism as a hypothesis, you could still research it, and so on. So he received this admonition in 1616 saying that heliocentrism was false and contrary to scripture, and he received a court order. So Galileo received a court order at that point, or an injunction, that he was not to claim that Copernicanism was real or to advocate for it because there was no evidence for it. And this was a personal court order. It wasn't a broad, wide one. But what else did happen is that some books were added to the index. So Foscarini's letter on a Pythagorean opinion was added, as was Diego de Zuniga's commentaries on Job. And Copernicus's De Revolutionibus was added to the index, but only as a withdrawal because they were modifying it to be in line with its own preface. If you recall, we talked about the preface that was added by Osiander, who said that it was a mathematical tool and not real. And actually what the Inquisition thought they were doing is they thought that they were legalizing what Copernicus, the original gangster, had said, right? So this is what was in his preface. They didn't know it had been added by Osiander, and they said, well, this will be the legal norm. And that's what happened. So the Revolutionibus was released again in 1620, and you could buy it throughout the rest of history without any issue with the small modifications. It was a few paragraphs. They had lines crossed out with a few words added just to say this is a hypothesis. It's not real. I
see.
And we can see from so Bellarmine wrote a letter to Foscarini, which was also clearly intended for Galileo. And in it, he said, well, actually, the problem is that you don't have evidence for what you're claiming. If you had evidence, then we would have accepted your interpretation of Scripture. And this was a standard, actually. This is what St. Augustine and St. Aquinas had written, that if science was contrary to Scripture, then Scripture should be interpreted in the light of science. Or it should be treated allegorically. So this is what Galileo had actually proposed was according to them, and what Bellarmine said, well, that would be right if you had evidence, but you don't.
I see.
So what happened after that is Galileo went away. He didn't try to push.
At this point, he was still a free man.
Yes, absolutely. He didn't receive any temporal punishment at that point. He didn't have his works put on the index. He'd had a slap on the wrist, and actually he was a bit worried about this because it seemed like too good to be true that he'd go away with everything. And he sought assurance about it, and I think some people had perhaps sent out rumors that he'd been to see the Inquisition. He must have been in trouble. What a naughty boy! And he went to see Pope Paul V, and Paul V assured him that he would not be prosecuted as long as the Pope lived. And he went to Bellarmine, and Bellarmine wrote him a certificate. Now, this was a bit intriguing because Galileo persuaded Bellarmine to write him a certificate that was a bit... it wasn't quite as strict as the actual court order he'd been given. So Bellarmine wrote him a certificate that was a bit more liberal in terms of what Galileo was allowed. So after this is taking a long time, but we'll get there eventually. In 1623, Maffeo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII. Now, Maffeo Barberini had actually written some text, and he defended Galileo in his 1616 investigation. Now this is
he was okay with the Galileo. I mean, they were. He defended him.
Yeah. So to be clear, Pope Urban VIII was not a heliocentrist. He was something else. He was what we would call an instrumentalist. Now, that means he believed that he didn't believe that scientific experiment could prove either heliocentrism or geocentrism to be true. He thought that it would always remain a philosophical debate as to which was true. But because of this, he defended Galileo because he said, well, actually, it could be right for all we know, but we just can't possibly ever know. It's that kind of idea. And it's the idea that actually you could model any scientific model and you couldn't ever actually absolutely determine it, because you could modify any model enough to fit some observation. That's the kind of thinking, right? But because he became Pope, Galileo thought he had a chance, and he went to see the Pope 6 times. He consulted him on his dialogues, but then he ignored the Pope's evidence. So what he did, he went away, he modified the book to make it more pro-Copernican than it had been when he'd been talking to the Pope. Then he found a way to get an imprimatur, so this is like, the peer review, from someone who was completely incompetent. What he should have done is he should have sent his book, because he was more or less ready. He should have sent it off to the appropriate person in Rome to have it checked. But what he did is he went back to I think Florence, and he had the papal nuncio, who wasn't so scientifically minded, look over it and give him an imprimatur. And he published the work. He published in Italian. It sold well. Typically books that were academic were published in Latin, and he published in Italian. And this book is quite interesting if you know what we've said already, which is that, the Tychonic model held the scientific consensus, and actually the dialogue was a straw man attack, because it was attacking the Ptolemaic model, which was frankly not being used by astronomers anymore.
So it was a straw man argument against geocentrism, which wasn't even giving acknowledgement to the Tychonic model.
Exactly, yes.
That's right.
Now, he had made arguments against the Tychonic model in other places, but not in that way. So one thing that Galileo had supported in the past was he had supported the idea that comets were sublunar, between the Earth and the Moon. And he hadn't actually ever observed one, but he used this as a method to try and attack Tycho, who had said they were above the Moon, further away. And he perhaps thought that he'd dealt with Tycho in this way already. But anyway, the publication of the dialogue, because it was so pro-Copernican, was breaking his court order, and he was taken to court. And it's interesting because he also lied in court. He said in court, I was actually arguing for geocentrism, and I disproved Copernicus in this book, because the book was a dialogue, right? It was a dialogue between 3 people, and they presented kind of both arguments, but it was very clear that he was arguing for the pro-Copernican side. But certainly he committed perjury in his in the trial. And the other thing he did is he brought along Bellarmine's certificate, the toned down one I told you about, the one that was more liberal. And he said, well, look, it's actually, I wasn't said, nothing that bad was said about what I should do. And then they presented the injunction against him and said, no, you're wrong. We've got the document here that says you're not allowed to do this, and, you're in big trouble. So this is where we get to something that we're not sure about, which is we know that a part of the trial, or part of the reason he was punished in all of this, was that he had embarrassed the Pope. And how do we know that? It's because in a letter that he wrote later to the Pope, he kept up correspondence with the Pope. He wrote a letter later where he apologized for embarrassing the Pope. But we're not entirely sure what that embarrassment was. Now, perhaps it was due to the fact that the Simplicio character, simpleton, it could be translated as, was saying something along the lines of what the Pope was saying. So perhaps he was claiming the Pope was a simpleton. This is a theory that's supported by a variety.
This is in his book that he released.
Exactly.
He presented the Pope as this simple-minded person.
Mm-hmm. And this is a theory that some historians of science hold, but actually we have no evidence that that was it, because there's no reference to this analogy from before or during the trial. It's only mentioned afterwards. So it could very well just be a rumor started after the trial as a response to the trial. And Simplicius was actually an Aristotelian philosopher in the 5th, 6th century who had argued for and against Aristotelian physics. So he was actually quite a person. He was a person that would make sense to be in that book, because Galileo was also addressing various things about the Aristotelian cosmology.
Right.
Now, perhaps an argument going the other way would be that, the Napoleonic investigators, they concluded that this Simplicio analogy was what caused the anger and the trial of 1633, and perhaps they lost some of the documents that supported this, because not all the documents made it back to the Inquisition. But I'm not sure that's true either, because we have a lot of documents, and you'd expect something to be in there. Now, if it's not that, if it's not the Simplicio analogy, then what was the embarrassment? It was most likely the fact that he had consulted the Pope and then changed things and then broken a court order, therefore implicating the Pope in an illegal act, right? In breaking the court order of the Inquisition. Perhaps he hadn't told the Pope that he had a court order at all. But either way, implicating the Pope in something like this was bad, because the Pope had many enemies in court. Now, to give you a bit of context about the Pope, so the head of the Inquisition didn't like the Pope. He didn't like the master of the Sacred Palace, who was in charge of imprimaturs. The Spanish cardinals were causing a lot of trouble, and they used this to criticize the Pope. In fact, in 1636, there was an assassination attempt, most likely, but he caught it before it happened, and he sent all of them home. And then there were a whole variety of intriguing things about coming from astrology. There were predictions in the 1620s made that in 1628 and 1630, the eclipses would herald the Pope's doom. And in fact, the Pope had actually, what he'd done is he'd freed a known astrologer, Tommaso Campanella, to come work for him. And Tommaso Campanella had written a book called The Siderali Fato Vitanda, so how to avoid the fate dictated by the stars. So the Pope had these predictions of impending doom, and he was a bit sensitive about a lot of these things. And in 1631, someone else made a horoscope predicting the Pope's death, and the Pope released a papal bull condemning judicial astrologers. So there's a whole thing that was going on with the Pope. There were the variety of wars going on. He was things were quite frail at court, and an additional criticism isn't something he wanted. In general, embarrassing a head of state in the early modern era wasn't a very smart idea. Right. But this was all involved. So that's kind of the summary of everything that happens.
It's interesting. I mean, he was essentially betrayed by Galileo. I mean, he came to Galileo's defense at his initial injunction, and then he just sort of went behind his back and went ahead and then perhaps alluded to the Pope being a simple-minded person in his book. It's not clear, maybe, but that would seem to be a motivation for putting someone on trial.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Galileo wanted to betray him. I think he was a schemer. Galileo's really smart, and I think he might have been just a bit too arrogant. He thought here's a way he could do all of this to get heliocentrism out, right? And he'd got approval from the Pope to write something like this, and he could use that to get this published and and all these other things. And he thought this is his great chance. I think that's probably how he thought about it.
Right.
But yeah, but certainly the results of this were absolutely tragic, right? So he was convicted of vehement suspicion of heresy. Now, that's not the same as formal heresy. One mistake people often think is that heliocentrism was considered a heresy, but it was never declared to be a heresy. Galileo was given this charge of vehement suspicion of heresy, which was usually given to people who had aided or housed known heretics. So it was still kind of bad, but it's like manslaughter to murder. It's not as bad, right? And typically people with this kind of charge would have just been given a penance. They would have been told to go away, do some prayers, maybe at worst, walk on your knees to Jerusalem or something. But it wasn't typically punished so much. And Galileo's punishment was really excessive for such a charge, and people were surprised by this, right? So and to be clear about this as well, Galileo's punishment wasn't as bad as people think. He wasn't tortured. He didn't go to jail. He was in house arrest, and in a nice house arrest. It was much nicer than your COVID lockdown. He was living first in the mansion of the Archbishop of Siena, huge house, and then he moved to his mansion in Florence, and he had servants there, and he was actually
he was on house arrest. Yeah, servants.
Yeah, and it wasn't exactly house arrest. It was what you could really call it is it was like you could call it freedom of the countryside, because he was allowed to leave for a variety of reasons. He could go to town to see the doctor. He could meet various people. But what he couldn't do is he couldn't go into public space, or openly teach or things like that. But still,
I suppose they didn't have like ankle bracelets or tracking devices back then. So I suppose there's some freedom in that. But
that's not to play it down either. It was an excessive punishment.
Sure.
It was people were really shocked by it. And certainly the Pope was quite unchristian about it, because he did ask for forgiveness. You had actually various other rulers, the King of Poland and the French ambassador, pleaded to the Pope that he should pardon Galileo, and he was a great man. He could do a lot more things. That Pope should pardon him, and the Pope said, "No, I'm not. I'm not pardoning him. I'm not not doing that." It was certainly quite drastic, yeah.
No, it does seem. I mean, it had serious ramifications for the image of the church. This is the quintessential example that people point out that, the church is backwards in its ways, despite all of the scientific knowledge that it was spreading in universities and some of the scrutiny that the church actually performed for science. That gets blurred out in the details of this story.
I mean, the church was clearly at fault in a variety of ways, right? But it was it made different faults than what people assume it did, right? It wasn't running a huge anti-scientific campaign. What was happening was there was too strict. So in 1616 there was a lack of belief, of kind of freedom of disinformation, right? They wanted this clear clarity that heliocentrism was just a hypothesis. In 1633, it was a complete shambles of bureaucracy, right? And multiple people are at fault. Multiple people made embarrassing choices. So there were lots of mistakes made, but they aren't as nefarious as is typically imagined. Or perhaps some of them were more nefarious than imagined, but in different ways. Perhaps people were trying to figure out how to assassinate the Pope, and this was all part of it. So it's
that's right.
It's more complex than is usually thought.
Right. So, how did, after this trial and public example of Galileo, how did this affect the the progression of scientific thinking through the rest of this century.
Yeah. So a lot of people say that the church held back science as a result of this.
That's also a common narrative.
And I think there's three parts to this. One is that the church wasn't trying to drag back science. Two, the second point is that the things they had done perhaps could have dragged back science. But the third point would be that it didn't. And a lot of the things they did actually had the contrary effect to what it would kind of logically do. And I'll go through some of that. So now heliocentrism could always be studied and written about, because you could always hold as a hypothesis in pretty much all textbooks of the time. I translate Riccioli, and he writes extensively about heliocentrism, about Copernicus' model, about Kepler's model, and so on. There was no problem with that. And Kepler's initial two models weren't ever put on the index. The De Revolutionibus could always be bought, just so long as you had the edit. But actually, most people owned it without the edit because it was, frankly, just available in the original format. The Inquisition didn't really enforce the ban at all. So Owen Gingerich did a survey of all the copies of De Revolutionibus, for example, and the little censorship of the book where there were minor edits of the paragraphs, it was done in about half the books in the Papal States. So they weren't enforcing it very well in the Papal States. And outside of the Papal States, there was very few that were implemented. As I said before, the Spanish Inquisition had rejected the Roman Index of 1633. The Polish Inquisition didn't care about this stuff. I think the only thing that the Polish Inquisition ever did was they persecuted Hussites, the followers of Jan Hus, and perhaps converts to Judaism. That was kind of the extent. Copernicanism was really not on their radar of interest. No. Right. And then there was no issues with observations. You could still continue your scientific work without issues, because the main part of science is still observing and building models, right? And actually, whether you state it's real or not, it doesn't necessarily impact that process. Some authors just didn't care about this at all. They just wrote openly about heliocentrism, and what happened? They were put on the index, and they weren't usually punished in it. Well, I don't think anyone was punished apart from Galileo in terms of temporal matters. They would be added to the index, and then the index didn't really stop people from buying the book. What actually happened is it worked as free marketing for them, because what you had a list of books going around the whole known world, telling everyone these are the kind of edgy books of the time where you can find out about heliocentrism, right?
Right.
So it was obviously not the intent of the index, but it had the opposite effect. I remember reading something about it recently, but I can't recall the actual person or whatever. But I read that in England, some publisher even printed a fake version of the index to promote some of the books they were selling. It clearly worked. And then you had you could publish in any other country that wasn't essentially the Papal States without much issue. What was a reaction to the Galileo Affair was the creation of independent academic societies and journals. So you have the Journal des Savants, you have the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, both in 1665, and then the Memoirs de l'Académie des Sciences come out in 1666. So the independent journals came out at that point. This meant you could also publish with them. You didn't have to get an imprimatur, and it would go straight to all the scientists. So there were, the reliance on the church for getting your work published was really diminished.
Right.
And the church was, this was a minor part of the church's involvement with science that, continuing that time. The church was increasing funds for astronomy. They were, because there was a lot happening with the invention of the telescope. There was lots of things to discover. they were putting a lot of funds in. And by the 1700s, the 4 top observatories actually been built on top of churches. And wow. a lot of churches and cathedrals, if you ever get a chance to look at them in Europe, I don't think it'll be in America,
sure, yeah.
but in Europe they have sundials or gnomons or variety of equipment on them that is astronomical. And this is something that they did.
I didn't realize that.
Frankly, up until much later, there was no evidence of heliocentrism. So what is the progress that was stopped? Right?
That was what I wanted to ask next. Is what was the convincing evidence of heliocentrism?
This is quite fascinating because things changed in a quite odd order. But by Galileo's time, there was already a decent amount of people. They were still a minority, but people who supported heliocentrism. And of course, the majority was the T-conic model, but even the T-conic model had variations as well. So you had, for example, the Longomontanus model, which was a T-conic model, but the Earth span. It was still at the center, but it was spinning. So there were a few variations like that. But Kepler's epitome of Copernican astronomy, which was put on the index as well in 1619, but it had good sales and it was really persuasive. It had Kepler's 3 laws explicitly written in it, without all the fluff of his other occult ideas, and that was quite successful. And in England, the consensus shifted probably earlier than anywhere else. You have the English astronomers convinced by Kepler, and you have, for example, Jeremiah Horrocks, who unfortunately died at the age of just 22. But by 1641, he'd applied Kepler's laws to the moon and improved the model of the moon considerably. And this was a foundation stone for what Newton could achieve. In 1645, Ismail Boulio published his Astronomia Philolaica with conics, so what we discussed before. With conic sections, you could start to explain hyperbolic trajectories of comets. So this was decent, but still not entirely persuasive. Why? Because in 1651, Riccioli first in 1651, he made further arguments for geocentrism state. He predicted that there should be a Coriolis effect if the Earth's spinning.
So, to be honest, before meeting you, I wasn't really familiar with Riccioli much at all. But then I started looking into the Coriolis effect, and it was his work where this effect was the first record of this Coriolis effect in recorded history, as far as I can tell.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. So he figured out this must exist if the Earth's spinning. But he then argued that it couldn't be measured at the time. So actually the fact there was no Coriolis effect meant that the Earth was stationary. And this is fascinating because actually the Coriolis effect was then not observed or demonstrated for another 2 centuries. So not until Foucault's pendulum in 1851. But let's jump back to the times, because what was really the big deal was Newton's works and Newton's Principia. What it did is it showed that the physics that was local also applied to the physics of the celestial bodies. So you could actually you could use the same theory here and there. What this was, it was the first unified theory of everything, the first unified philosophy that accounted for the small and the big, right? And so this could finally replace Aristotelian thoughts, and it was better in every way. It fitted the Kepler's model. It fitted Galileo's physics. Now, Galileo's physics is also an interesting thing because Riccioli actually proved Galileo's physics. Riccioli was, he was a geocentrist, but he did considerable work to prove Galileo's physics. He did an experiment that was unprecedented in accuracy. He spent days timing a pendulum against stellar phenomena, so the rotation of the stars, to try and he counted every single pendulum swing to make sure that he knew how long the pendulum swings were, and then he could measure the actual length of times of falling bodies, and he could show that acceleration was parabolic, right? So Newton's theory accounted for Galileo's physics and all these other things. So this was the real persuasive thing. After Newton, you see the scientific consensus switching the other way. This is when heliocentrism won over. And the intriguing thing there is that this was a change of theory. There was no new empirical evidence yet that had actually arrived to show that heliocentrism was true. Sorry?
So at the time, Newton developed his gravity.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There was no empirical evidence, experimental evidence that showed the rotation of the Earth. But his theory showed that it's not impossible, and it reproduced.
Yeah, exactly.
Various,
it had huge benefits. It was just, and not only did it fit Kepler's ellipses, but also you could start accounting for deviations from the ellipses in the various stars and so on, right? So Newton's theory is even today used for planetary computation, right?
Right.
I've talked to a few physicist friends who do this, and they say, well, we wouldn't use general relativity unless things are relativistic, right? Because frankly, general relativity still is only useful once you get to the limits of Newtonian mechanics, right?
I mean, the Newton's theory falls out of the general relativity and
exactly, yeah,
low mass limit, right? So
yeah,
it's
yeah. So what happened after Newton? So there were still some scientists who were geocentrists, of course. A surprising one, for example, is the Cassini family. Now, you've probably heard of the Cassini probe, because that's quite a big one. It went to visit, I think, the Saturn's rings and Saturn's moons.
That's right.
Now, the Cassini, they were a whole family of astronomers. Grandfather and the son, they were avid geocentrists. They wrote a lot to Riccioli and back again. So they were actually keen geocentrists, and one of the debates of the time was, for example, about the shape of the Earth. And Cassini believed that the Earth was shaped like a rugby ball, and Newton predicted that if the Earth's spinning, what should happen is there should be an equatorial bulge. It should be a bit thicker around the equator. And there was in the 1700s, there was a bit of a race to try and figure this out and calculate the actual shape of the Earth. And Cassini made measurements that actually suggested it was rugby ball shaped. But then in 1736, Purchas had led an experiment that showed that actually there was an equatorial bulge. But that wasn't the first evidence of that was empirical evidence. What came before was Bradley aberration. Now, I always struggle to explain this with just my hands and my face.
That's okay.
In short, what Bradley aberration is it's if you're traveling in a certain direction, there's a slight effect where you see the stars move slightly closer to you because you're moving in that direction. And he showed, so he was actually trying to measure stellar parallax, but he didn't have a telescope accurate enough for that.
You need a more powerful telescope.
But what he could show was that there was this aberration, and it worked with the seasons. So when the Earth was traveling in one direction around the sun, it was those stars that were being drawn in, and when he went in another direction, it was those stars, and so on. So that was the first 1727 Bradley aberration, the first empirical evidence of heliocentrism. Quite almost a century after Galileo.
Wow.
And after the equatorial bulge, people were entirely convinced. It was at this point that the Church, the Inquisition, started dropping various rules and so on. But in the two main arguments from Galileo's time against geocentrism, stellar parallax and the Coriolis effect, were not actually observed till the 1800s. So stellar parallax, I think 1836. I think Bessel observed it. And then 1851, it was demonstrated by Foucault's pendulum. And the intriguing thing is the Coriolis effect is named after Coriolis, but Coriolis didn't come up with the idea. He didn't build the best mathematical model for it, and he didn't demonstrate it either. So these two problems had actually gone away a bit earlier because stellar parallax became less of a problem as optics was better understood, and people stopped naively trying to measure stellar diameters by just the width in their eyepiece. And the Coriolis effect became less of an issue with the mathematics of Euler, who calculated it fairly accurately and showed it was quite a small effect that couldn't easily be measured.
Right.
But these days, it's taken for granted, right? It's a vital part of meteorology and how cyclones are formed.
That's right.
So on. So
with the physics of hurricanes and weather patterns, it's very apparent, but without satellite imagery, it's a little bit more difficult to ascertain. Why did it take so long for the church to finally apologize for Galileo?
Okay, so this is a funky one. So you're probably referring to the 1992 speech of John Paul II, right? Now,
that's right.
Have you actually read it? Here's a question.
I think I've seen clips, and it's almost an ambiguous apology. So because from what you read, the documentation that says, "Oh, this 1992 is when the church formally apologized," but then I see some quotes from his letter or speech. It's ambivalent. So
I think it's hard to claim that it was actually an apology. I don't think he actually apologized. What he did do is he made an admission of fault. He definitely said the church was wrong to treat the Galileo as it did, but I wouldn't say he apologized for it. And it wasn't a formal statement. It was a kind of ad hoc statement that he made after a report he'd started in 80, I think, 1980, was read out, and then he made this statement afterwards, informally. And it seemed what actually had happened is he'd rejected the results of the report. He wasn't happy with how the report had done, and perhaps he was even trying to shut down the continuation of this reporting body on the Galileo Affair. And there were a variety of problems with the with the reports. One of which was they didn't actually involve any scholars of Galileo in it. So there were a variety of problems with it, and I'm not sure we could call it an apology. But it also wasn't the first statement made by the church either. So pretty soon after the empirical evidence started appearing, what happened was the Inquisition started to retract the various bans. So in 1744, they allowed Galileo's Opera Omnia, that's essentially all his works, to be published. And it was published under the editorship of Giuseppe Taldo. And in 1758, they removed the generic ban on heliocentrism. Now, while the generic ban was removed, there was still a few works that were there that they hadn't removed. And this was the works of Galileo, the unedited version of the Revolutionibus, and the works of Foscarini and Diego de Zuniga. And the reason for that was they said it was bureaucratic. It was so Joseph Lalande tried to ask them to remove it, and they said, well, actually, we can't remove it because it was added by a trial, and legally we can only remove things that have been added as part of a trial, as part of another trial. So in 1820, there was an interesting trial. There was a guy called Giuseppe Setele, and he wanted to publish a heliocentric work, and the master of the Sacred Palace refused to grant him an imprimatur. He was a very late comer to the party. He was still a geocentrist. He wasn't convinced by heliocentrism. He said, no, I will not publish this. And the Inquisition came in, and they ran a trial around this, and they told the master of the Sacred Palace, no, you have to publish this. So it was the exact opposite case where they forced a heliocentric work through. And wow. As a result of this trial, not immediately, I think perhaps it might be as late as the 1830s, as a result of that trial, they removed the works of Galileo and Foscarini and Zuniga from the index. Of course, the funny thing being that you could, by that point, there was over a century of time you could have bought Galileo's full works, but he was still on the index. So so to be honest, by the end of the 17th century, after Newton, these laws were dead letter laws. Do you know what dead letter laws are? So it's the kind of you probably don't have so many of them in the US because you're not old enough. But in the UK, we have, for example, laws like on Sunday, every adult over the age of 12 should be practicing their longbow, right? But no one follows these laws. It's
right.
these
I
legacy
suppose we
laws.
have a few, but it's
I think there's ones about crocodiles being tied to hydrants or something like that somewhere. I've read about that, but
maybe down in Florida or something.
But this is kind of it. They were dead letter laws. They weren't followed, and the Inquisition over time removed them, which was a lot earlier, right?
Right.
But certainly apology. No, there was no clear apology. I guess we could raise questions about what does an institutional apology even mean, right? But
well, that's a good point. It doesn't, and obviously the main actors involved are well long and gone. So
and I think there is a complexity around the story because Galileo was at some fault. He made some faults that he could have been punished for, but the punishment was excessive. You'd have to
right.
I'm not like if I was to draft something, it would be if I was to draft an apology for the church, it would be quite a long document that would try to be very clear about everything. It's
right.
Yeah.
So is that the best way to view Galileo from a modern perspective? Is that he wasn't entirely an innocent scientist, but
so he wasn't.
Perhaps
innocent is a fun word. Galileo was definitely not innocent. He was a bit of a troll. He was quick-witted. He had a serpent tongue, right? He could rip people apart, and people would laugh because he was really, really witty, really smart, really funny.
Right.
And he lied about quite a lot of things. So Chris Graney recently discovered that Galileo, for example, he covered up his discovery of Mizar, which was Mizar is a double star, but Galileo had actually observed it, and the problem was that he'd observed it and he'd looked for stellar parallax and he hadn't found it, and because of that, he didn't tell anyone he'd observed it because that would be evidence against him. And similarly, I think Bonamici brought him some data about the tides from the Atlantic, and Galileo had written some things in his earlier discourse on the tides, and he'd included almost the same text in the dialogue. But what he didn't do, he didn't present this evidence saying, well, this is what the evidence shows, because the evidence didn't agree with him. So what he did is he crossed out he removed the bits where he'd made assertions where he was wrong, and just kept the other bits like it hadn't changed anything. And he also lied about a variety of things. He lied in court, of course. He lied in he lied he had a few disputes with various astronomers over precedence, over who observed what first, right? And the funny thing was, he lied about things he didn't need to lie about. So he'd actually observed a lot of things first, but he made the date earlier to be sure he could, get precedence. Right. And so some of it's really ironic, really quite funny, and really quite petty, frankly. But he still needs to be remembered as a key person in astronomy, but probably even more in physics than in astronomy, because his physics was a big change, a foundation stone for Newton as well.
That's right.
And some people call him a father of science. I wouldn't call him a father of science, but certainly he was a key player in it. He got some things wrong, his theories of tides or comets, but he also got a lot right, and a lot. There's a surprising amount. He did bits on thermodynamics. He did bits on falling objects, and a lot of it's really quite interesting. And even in the bits he got wrong, he got some bits, he was getting close to something. So in his discourse on the tides, he talks about wind and atmospheric motion, and it seems like if he had just a little bit more, a bit more access to good data, he might have come up with Hadley cells long before they were found. He had a lot of really interesting ideas, and he was a great science popularizer. He wrote in Italian. He was great at polemics. He knew how to destroy his enemies. He knew how to write to a popular audience. He was probably the first popularizer of science. So definitely you can look up to him for that. And he was smart and a schemer, which was part of his downfall. But I wouldn't say he was imprudent like Giordini said. It was more he knew what he was doing. He probably knew there was some risk to it, but he was willing to take that risk. He thought he might be able to get away with it because perhaps he was a little bit arrogant, right?
Right.
Some historians are far more aggressive about this than me. I don't know if there's Tony Christie or someone like Arthur Koestler who wrote The Sleepwalkers. They absolutely rip Galileo apart. But I'm quite. I actually like Galileo. I find his character quite likable. He just the fact he's a bit of a schemer, a bit of a. He's very passionate for sure. He was very passionate about the subject. He wanted to get it all out. He was, but yes, he was probably overrepresented for the era. And there are other scientists who are as, or sometimes even more interesting than him from the era. Kepler is, a phenomenal mind. He should really have the lightning, be known for much better than Galileo. But we go back to what's a good story, and Galileo's story in the popular narrative is just addictive, right?
Right. No, I mean, and it's interesting that still in recent time there's still uncovering new information about this case and some of the details that transpired. So I guess I would also kind of just like to, I know it's getting late over there, so I don't want to keep you too much longer, but
it's all right.
I would like to bring in this story to the context of the modern day a little bit. Just the implications. Why should they care about getting this narrative right? And does this have implications for how the relationship of science and society relates today? And how should people view this narrative now?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to get history straight, to get it right, and to be detailed about it, and to understand the nuance in it. Now, the first thing to think about is we don't want to lie to people about history, because if they discover that we lied, then they won't trust us anymore, right? And this happens over and over again. I think things like flat Earth theory get prominent because there are also people who don't know enough or who have lied about various things, and they jump on this, and then they, as a corollary, they add all these other things that they can't prove. But it's almost like they've got.
This is how conspiracies start, right? They find some crack in the history that doesn't quite fit the popular narrative that they learn in school or on the internet, and then they sort of juxtapose all of this other information.
And flat Earth, it's not the most worrying of those of things that come out that way, right? So there's certainly a lot to learn from the Galileo Affair, and we have learned many things from it as a society. So the concepts of freedom of speech would have been quite alien then. Now it's almost a given, right? Everyone believes in some level of freedom of speech, or the way we've split out science from other institutions, that we try to depoliticize it. That's also something that we learned as a result. Now, an interesting thing is you can't entirely isolate science from politics. There's always some kind of grant chasing or alliances made within scientific communities. But certainly, what scientists strive to do is to try to isolate it away from that, right?
That's right.
But we also have not solved many of the problems that were present in the Galileo Affair. So right now, I'd say misinformation is more rife than ever before, right? And
I fully agree.
And it's not just in the common sphere. We also have had issues of poor quality journals, scientific journals, right? So I don't know if you've heard about the Sokal hoax, but this guy Sokal, he showed that he could publish absolutely rubbish papers in a variety of journals, and they were accepting it. And it showed,
it's completely made up.
Exactly.
Was it a physicist?
Yeah, he was a physicist, but he was publishing in social science journals. I don't know if he considered this a rivalry between just saying that physics is much better, but it's not just in social science that there's also a wide replication crisis in a variety of spheres. Psychology is a really big one. I think I read somewhere that one of the big problems of psychology is most of the tests are being run on psychology students, and they are not very representative of even the wider population in their own countries, let alone across the world. But we also have we still have retractions, something like the index, right? So there's a website called Retraction Watch, and they chase the big journals and their retractions, and these are often done quite stealthily. So recently, I think Springer withdrew about 200 papers. They didn't tell anyone about it.
That's not widely known, I guess.
Exactly. So it's often unclear and hidden when these retractions happen. They do happen, but they're not publicized. And this can seem quite
embarrassing.
This can seem quite disingenuous, right? If people look at this and they can lose trust of these journals. And I'm not saying Springer's bad. I've got plenty of Springer books on my shelf.
Nature retracts articles all the time too, and that's one of the most esteemed journals of all science.
Yeah. And while we have this huge amount of misinformation, we also have a fairly decent amount of censorship as well. And governments really want this censorship. You have anything from Facebook blocking climate science misinformation, which, perhaps you could argue they should do, but people consider the fact that they do it a part of their conspiracy theory. Here they are shutting us down, right?
It's just like the church of the 17th century. By putting these heliocentric books on the ban list, it gives people more curiosity to just investigate it for themselves. So then, if the climate scientists are still scientists like any other, and if there are theories that counteract the Earth warming model or making things less severe than they really are, then by retracting that or downplaying that, it's not really getting an honest opinion of the scientific discourse.
Yeah. Although the converse isn't true either. So if someone is suppressing something, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong, right? It doesn't mean that the thing they're suppressing is necessarily right either.
That's right.
So I can. The thing is, in any, if you have a group of people, say if you're stranded on an island, or if you're on a ship and a group was starting a mutiny, you ultimately have to take a decision to suppress it. So there are scenarios where you do have to suppress ideas, and that's. But in wider society, this is a real problem. When should it be applicable? When shouldn't it? I think things have got a bit crazier now. You've got Elon Musk getting X blocked entirely in Brazil, right?
Right.
And another interesting case is around COVID and vaccinations, right? And I'm not entirely sure what you had in the USA, but certainly there was a kind of censorship, and it wasn't entirely from the media. It was also people not willing to debate or discuss things, or just shutting down conversations in general. And that's not to say that I think that there was a conspiracy or that vaccines were wrong, but I'm not convinced that the shutting down of conversations and blocking public discourse was helpful. I'm not sure that helped to build trust in it. Maybe others disagree. We might never know, because we don't have a comparison study, right? We don't have a placebo that we can test against. Would open debates have been better? I don't know.
I honestly don't know, because you're competing with two different sides of the coin, and there's the trust the science camp, and then there's the doubt everything that any scientist ever says. It's not really there is a middle ground there, and it's called scientific discourse.
But it's an abyss.
Is the general public equipped with handling this scientific discourse?
Yes, so that's an interesting question, and whether you can trust the public, and whether, and a lot of people wouldn't be able to follow scientific discourse, but conspiracy theories aren't limited to unintelligent people either. Typically a conspiracy theorist will actually be across a whole broad range of varieties of intelligence, and it can be linked to variety of mental health issues as well, and so on. So it's never so simple. But yeah, so there's still a lot to learn even from the Galileo case in these things, and there's perhaps there's no clear answer. Perhaps some of these things can't be solved at all. There is a kind of trade-off, right? There's a trade-off between free speech and trust, between censorship and social cohesion. There's perhaps no way to solve these, but certainly it's worth studying them, and it's worth knowing the things. And there's the other thing I was thinking about was this fact that if you don't have a nuance in historical events and understand the details, if the ideas from the alternative ideas from the past are presented back again, they can suddenly seem really persuasive because you have never seen them before. And we've seen this happen a few times recently. So what I was thinking about is even recent history. So there was this recent craze of TikTokers who were reading Osama bin Laden's letter and saying, well, actually, I quite agree with the things he's saying. But, in the context living back then, or if you know what was actually happening, if you understand the historical events around it, you know exactly why it was an evil document, why you would never support it. And then the same with Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Daryl Cooper, which started a whole craze on all sorts of social media where people were watching Hitler's speeches, and they were saying, well, I actually kind of agree with some of the stuff that Hitler was saying, and
I've seen these,
and this is absolutely disastrous, right? Because
yes, absolutely.
We if you don't understand the context and you don't understand why it was wrong, if you don't understand the nuances in the debate at the time, then you are leaving yourself open to being reinitiated into these ideologies, right? So I think it's really important to understand historical nuance, to understand history in detail. I hope that's a strong argument.
No, I think that is the key takeaway from all of this, is to not fall victim for misplaced ideas and ideologies that have sort of been put on the backside in the history of things. So yeah, and I hope that the takeaway message is for people to stay informed and to look into this themselves. Yeah. So
I worry I've taken up way too much of your time. It's been almost...
I this has been a very fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it. I'll put some links on the resources in the description, and encourage people to look in this a little further for themselves. But Michal, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and thank you for taking your time, because
it's really okay. No, it's great. If a great place to follow this up, and if you're interested, Galileo Affair, best book.
Sure.
Retrying Galileo. This is a book to buy if you want to figure out this book. It covers all the myths of the Galileo Affair, where they came from and how they spread. It's a really, really good book. And obviously buy my book, but
that's right. I will also link that in the description as well. So
yeah. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.